Welcome to Political Dharma. I'm Alan Zundel. I just heard the news that the big, beautiful bill Trump has been pushing on the Congress has passed the House of Representatives. And I will be commenting on that in another video, hopefully over the weekend, along with some other news updates. But I just learned of it, so it's not going to be part of this video. This video is about Joe Rogan's interview with Bernie Sanders that happened a little over a week ago last Monday on I'm not sure what the date was exactly, but he was on the Joe Rogan Experience, his podcast number 2341. If you want to look it up, it's on YouTube where I saw it. I first came across this video when I was working on another video for my other channel, Jesus Meets Buddha. No, actually, it's the other, Buddha Meets Jesus, an interview that Joe Rogan did with Wes Hupp, who is a increasingly well-known defender of the Christian faith. I made a video commenting on that video, and every time I went to YouTube to watch a little more of that video, I came across some thumbnails about this Bernie Sanders interview with Joe Rogan, and they intrigued me. Let me give you a sampling here, where they all seem to indicate that there was big contentious debate between the two of them in which Rogan got the better of Sanders. See some of these titles here. Joe Rogan leaves Bernie speechless after the fact checking. Bernie Sanders is caught off guard when Joe Rogan corrects him. Lefties losing it. Joe Rogan schools socialist hypocrite. Joe Rogan hammers Bernie with truth. Rogan shuts down Bernie Sanders over climate change. Bernie Sanders is caught off guard when Joe Rogan corrects him. So I saw these thumbnails and I thought, okay, I want to hear what he actually had to say. And then a viewer of mine suggested that I take a look at it because this viewer is a bartender who was working in a bar, and a lot of the patrons were discussing this Rogan interview with Bernie and said they thought that Rogan beat Bernie and it outdid Bernie. So I thought, okay, Bernie Sanders is a pretty smart guy and usually has his shtick down pretty well. So what is it about? What I found, and it took me a whole week watching this, trying to find the time to do bits and pieces of it, because the whole interview is about an hour and 50 minutes long. But what I found is that neither of them was really, let's put it this way, they agreed on more than they disagreed on. They agreed on almost everything in this interview. So there wasn't a lot of disagreement. The main points of contention had to do with, and Bernie often didn't even fight back on it, had to do with climate change for one thing. Another one was about Trump suing the media was another big one. But I looked it over and I decided, okay, I do want to talk about that. So I'm going to focus on 4 parts of the interview specifically, which were big parts of it. They covered a lot of ground and there was some digressions along the way. So you can imagine there was a lot they had to say. The 4 parts I'm going to look at specifically, one has to do with why workers are worse off now than they were, say, 40 years ago. And Bernie Sanders, I thought, did a good job of explaining how they're worse off and some of the things that have changed to make them worse off, but he didn't really explain very well why it happened. This is a long time peeve of mine about Bernie, how he makes the, well, I'll get into that when I show that clip, all right? So why workers are worse off now than they had been in the past, at least during a certain period in the past. Second one had to do with climate change, which a lot of those videos were exploiting to try to get viewers, I'm sure, by saying that, oh, he really took them down on this. So people who are maybe skeptical about climate change thought that Rogan was going to just devastate Bernie on the subject. What I found is that Rogan, his implication that climate change is not happening was not congruent with the article he was citing. In fact, it was presenting evidence the opposite of what Rogan was saying. So he leaned on this article, which either he didn't read very carefully or he misinterpreted or didn't read at all. I don't know. That's the second one, climate change. Third one is automation and the advances in artificial intelligence and how masses of people are going to be thrown out of work, what to do about it. They talked about this a lot and Rogan kept returning to it and pressing Bernie on how people are going to survive, how they're going to find meaning, whether we can trust the government to address this. A lot of questions raised in that part. And I think Bernie did a pretty good job on that, but actually I would have gone a little further than Bernie. So I'll comment on that one as well. And then finally, this idea of Trump suing the media. Rogan was very he was taking the side that this is something that needs to be done. The media has to be, there has to be consequences for falsifying information that they put out there. Bernie was taking the opposite stance, not on that question specifically, but on Trump's use of lawsuits against the media and his intentions in doing that. So in a sense, they were talking past each other. Let's get into the very first clip, though, so you have some idea what I'm talking about here. This one has to do with Rogan starts out the interview by asking Bernie, well, what he thinks about what's going on these days. I forget how he phrased it exactly. And Bernie, of course, goes into his litany of how inequality has grown to such great heights, historic heights, that a small fraction of 1% of the population, the billionaires, the very wealthy, are getting wealthier and wealthier, while as the rest of us are suffering, how workers can't get from paycheck to paycheck, and a lot of them don't have money for an emergency. So he talks about all this stuff, which he usually does. But then Rogan presses him on why this happened. And I don't think Bernie gave the best answers. Let's hear something of what he had to say. After I created my video, I had to remove large segments from the clips due to copyright claim.
You have the prevailing religion of the oligarchs and the corporate world is greed.
So, as I said, Bernie's good at describing some of the changes that have happened, especially in the political realm, the attacks on workers and unions, the trade agreements, the corruption of the political system by money, saying it's a rigged system that is used by people who could care less about the ordinary worker. But what does he think is the cause of this? It boils down to him for a change in corporate culture and more greedy billionaires. So it's very moralistic. These people are bad people. They're so greedy, they've ruined everything for the rest of us. I don't think it's true that they're especially greedy now. People who have a lot of money have always been greedy for more. It's a human characteristic, and it is moral failing in a lot of ways. But that can't be the whole reason, because business people have been greedy for a long time. In fact, if you look back previous to World War II, and going back, say, a century or more, you had these big steel companies and oil companies, mines and meat packing. They were exploiting laborers. And contrary to Bernie saying that they really cared about people, they didn't care. They wanted to make lots of money. Workers had very terrible conditions. So that's capitalism, right? They're pursuing profits, and they're willing to sacrifice workers' well-being in the pursuit of profits. And as Rogan said, there's competition forcing them in that direction. It's always been like that. So what changed? Why was there a change in culture to more greed, or what was it? Bernie doesn't answer that very well. I don't think it's moralism that's going to answer it. I think you have to look at how things have changed structurally to make politics different today. I'll expand on that a little bit here. So we had terrible conditions back over 100 years ago, and then the New Deal came along to address the Great Depression, which was, well, I won't get into causes of that because it's very difficult to explain it all in a way that everybody's going to follow. But the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt did all these things, like legalize labor unions and institute Social Security and help for the needy, and regulate businesses, especially banks and finance, did all these good things. Why were those things undone? Well, first of all, after the New Deal, people had it pretty well off in the 1950s and 60s in particular, especially white workers, working class people who were in unionized jobs. Now, the people of color, like the Native Americans and Black Americans, were not doing so well. They had to fight for rights, and in the 70s, it's got pretty heated, 60s and 70s. Anyway, but a lot of working people were better off in the 50s and 60s than they were before, and have been since. And the reason was that corporations were able to stave off competition in a lot of ways, so they could maintain profits by keeping their prices high and tolerating unions and higher wages and some benefits like health insurance and retirement benefits, and also pay higher taxes for this social safety net. All this stuff coming out of the New Deal, which was very popular among workers. And so politicians were trying to defend and maintain this. Business never liked it. Most business people would like to have seen it unravel, but as long as they were making decent profits, they didn't mind. Why were they making decent profits? Because after World War II, the United States had But it had the preeminent economic position. The countries of Western Europe and Japan, who were our main economic rivals before the war, were decimated by the war. Their factories were bombed out. They lost a lot of people. Houses were destroyed, all that. So they had to recover, and it took time for them to recover. Meanwhile, the United States had stimulated its economy with its war spending, was not invaded, was not bombed. So we had the means to, gear up our factories and keep them going and meet the needs of our domestic market. At the same time, we were also meeting needs of other countries that we're trying to rebuild. Well, what happened in the 70s is that Western Europe and Japan started to recover and give us more competition. Japanese were building better cars, and Germans were building a lot of cheap mass-produced cars like the Volkswagen, which people bought by the tons for their teenagers, including some of my friends. That's how we got around largely. So there was changes like that happening. Where was I at with this? There was greater competition, and so profits were being squeezed. And at the same time, the United States had a lock on world resources, was able to exploit resources around the world because of its dominance diplomatically and militarily to threaten other countries and to overturn regimes when we didn't like them. So we were able to exploit raw materials, especially oil from the Middle East. Well, a couple of things happened here. Number one, inflation happened largely because of the increase in oil prices when some of the Arab nations got together and formed a cartel to raise oil prices. That affected our economy overall because oil is used not only in manufacturing products, but in powering factories and in fueling cars and trucks and in jets. And so the price of oil goes up, the price of everything goes up. So inflation was happening, and people were falling into unemployment because this competition from abroad was scaling up. First of all, the car factories, where I was from, Detroit, you had the big three who were able to kind of collude. They weren't monopolies, so they weren't going to be sued, but they pretty much knew where prices were at, and each of them held to that line without having to actually talk to each other. So in most big businesses, you had just three major companies, but now there was competition from abroad, so they had to find out ways to maintain profits, even though their competition was squeezing, and they had lower prices, and they had to think about better, more efficient methods of working. And so they moved jobs abroad, and they broke unions. And because inflation and unemployment was so hard on the average citizen, they were looking around for scapegoats. And of course, Ronald Reagan came along to tell them that the problem was government spending, government regulation, unions asking too much. All this stuff led to inflation and unemployment. Therefore, we needed the government to undo all this. So number one, there was a crisis in profits because of foreign competition, and also because technology made it easier to move factories abroad, like better transportation with cargo ships and jet planes, better communications with satellite and internet, better data processing with the advances in computers. So it was easier to move things abroad and then become global companies rather than domestic companies. So you could have factories around the world, exploit cheap labor, and then do parts in make different parts in different parts of the world and bring them all together somewhere, and then bring them back to the U.S. market and other markets. So technology changes, squeeze on profits, all that. Politicians blaming the government for the problems people were experiencing, all that led to this change of politics and the rig system and the decline of the working class. That's what happened. That was the situation. That was the diagnosis. So it wasn't about greed. It wasn't about the moral failings of corporate people who even in the 60s and 50s were not going down to the factory floor to ask about your wife and children. In the big companies, especially maybe small businesses did that and still do that, but not the big companies. So it wasn't a change in culture of the corporations. It wasn't more greed on the part of people who had a lot of money. It was changes in the economy, changes in the world economy, changes in technology that made things globalized. And it's hard to see how we can get out of that situation now simply by returning to the New Deal, let alone returning to the 1920s with tariffs and the dismantling of government entirely. That is, of course, Trump's agenda is more like that, very much like the 1920s, in fact, with the crackdown on immigration and other policies. All right, so I find fault with Bernie and his diagnosis of why things change. He's not looking at structural changes. He's looking more at moral character, which doesn't make sense to me. All right. Then he talks about what he would do if he was president, and he has a lot of ideas there, campaign finance, funding by the government, um, Medicare for all, of course, funding colleges, making colleges for free, higher taxes, a lot of these things, but they don't all address the actual reasons that the economy had changed. So, in one respect, they're a good idea in protecting people. In another sense, people still have that hangover from the Reagan era of distrusting government to do all this stuff and the cost of all this stuff. All right, I won't get too deep into that because I could spend a lot of time with my ideas about that. Okay, that's number one. Number two, this is the one that a lot of the videos exploited from the interview by just taking some clips and making it sound like there was a big debate that Rogan had won against Bernie. This is the climate change argument. And I think here Rogan just simply got the article wrong that he was citing. And I don't know that Bernie had really good answers for him, but I do want to show you why Rogan was wrong. Here's what he had to say.
The Washington Post looked at it. What was the time period that they looked at? That essentially they found that we're in a cooling period. Scientists have captured the Earth's climate change over the last 485 million years. Here's a surprising place we stand now.
So there's three parts of what Rogan has to say here, three main parts. One is he cites this article from the Washington Post that's discussing a new scientific paper, and Rogan seems to imply that it's contradicting the idea that climate change is actually happening. This is a Washington Post article from September 19, 2024, and the writers were Sarah Kaplan and Simon Ducrochet. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Anyway, so the one argument is that maybe climate change has not actually happened. The other argument that Rogan makes is that, well, what are you going to do about China? Since they're the biggest polluter, we can't just lay down our arms against them and let them go on polluting. And number three is that there's a lot of money and power involved in the proposals to address climate change, that there's going to be companies that make money and get subsidies, and there's going to be greater capacity to surveil our use of energy and try to control our lives, what we're able to do and not do. And so he makes that argument. Let me address these one at a time. First of all, starting with that Washington Post article and the scientific paper that he was citing, I don't know if he didn't read it, if he just misunderstood it. Let's take a look at the chart that was kind of small on your screen when Joe Rogan put it up. But here is the far right hand of the chart. And the cooling trend he's talking about started about 50 million years ago and then was on a downward trajectory. That's going way back towards when the dinosaurs became extinct, and they had a long period of time with other extinct mammals before humankind shows up. But what you probably couldn't see in the shrunken part of that was at the very end, the current geological stage. I've circled in blue where that red line of the climate, the temperature of the climate suddenly spikes up again. What would that be? On a scale of millions of years, that is just recent past, specifically the Industrial Revolution, I think, and human culture in general, burning wood, burning coal, burning oil, all that stuff contributing to the spike upwards in the last 200, 500 years, however long, wherever you want to start. But it's certainly escalating in the last couple hundred years. And so contradicting the implication that Rogan's making that this shows that climate change is not happening, it shows that it definitely has been going up again. And in the short period of time that humans have been here and acclimatized to the temperatures and the kind of flora and fauna that thrives in that environment, we haven't been in a position where things change that much that fast. And let me take some text from that article just to reinforce the point. A woman named Judd was one of the scientists, the lead scientist on this study. She says, we know catastrophic events shift the landscape. That is, catastrophic events having to do with big changes in the climate. Quote from her, when the environment warms that fast, animals and plants can't keep pace with it. Right? And then she's paraphrased. At no point in the nearly 500 million years that Judd and her colleagues analyzed did the Earth change as fast as it is changing now. She adds, quote, in the same way as a massive asteroid hitting the Earth, what we're doing now is unprecedented, unquote. So the lead scientist in this paper is saying things are changing fast, and it's because humans are doing it. The takeaway from the article was incorrect, the way that Rogan was presenting it. Let me do another piece of this, just one more piece further down in the article. Another scientist who worked on the paper, Jess Tierney, says that it portrays a global climate that was more dynamic and extreme than researchers had imagined. So this is the value of this study. This is why it was a news item, that the climate didn't change gradually over time, but there was a lot of sudden changes, including the one we're current in. Going down there a little bit, but in keeping with decades of past research on climate, the chart hews closely to estimates of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, with temperatures rising in proportion to concentrations of the heat trapping gas. That's saying that their chart also shows, or their study also shows, that warming trends have to do with changes in the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. Exactly what we've been doing is pouring more carbon into the atmosphere, and that's why the temperature is in that more recent spike. Carbon dioxide is really that master dial, Tierney said. That's an important message in terms of understanding why emissions from fossil fuels are a problem today. So contrary to Rogan's implication that the study somehow throws climate change into question, it actually reinforces climate scientists' concern about how fast things are changing today, and that it has to do with human activity emitting carbon into the atmosphere. So he's just wrong about that one. This article does not support the implication that climate change is not real. As for China, well, it's true China puts a lot of pollution into the atmosphere, including carbon. They have been doing it for less time than the United States has, so I think we have a greater responsibility going back a couple hundred years, where China is just, gearing up its economy in the last 50 years or so. So we have more responsibility. Not only that a lot of the pollution coming out of China is coming from U.S. companies that build factories there to create products that they then sell in the U.S. market. So the United States has a responsibility for some of that economic activity in China that's actually adding to carbon in the atmosphere. And if the United States does not take the lead on this, why would China or any country that's just catching up with us in historic terms, why would they let it go? So I think we have to take responsibility for ourselves, not blame things on China and wait for them to take action. We have to take the lead, show the rest of the world we really take this seriously. And that's why they should take it seriously too. That's my 2 cents on that anyway. And then finally, the argument that Rogan makes is that people are exploiting this issue of climate change for the purposes of gaining wealth and power. Well, that's true, right? There are economic interests in people who want power, who exploit any issue to try to increase their wealth and power. That's true of every issue. And in fact, on this issue, it's certainly true of both sides of this. Not only are there companies that could profit from various renewable energy proposals and programs, and not always the best ones. Think of how they're using natural gas as a bridge to the to renewables, or how using well, anyway, there's ways that it is exploited. Yeah, I'll give you that. But on the other side of it, the climate change denialism, fossil fuel interests have been doing that for a heck of a long time. They're funding it. This Naomi Klein wrote a book about 20 years ago or so saying this changes everything, in which she documents how much money that the oil interests have, and other interests like the Koch brothers putting, who do infrastructure like pipelines to transport oil and natural gas, and have a lot of money coming out of that field, how they put a lot of money into climate denialism and funding these people who are not really climate scientists, but various scientists to try to dispute it and write papers that seem to contradict the official narrative, and by politicians who can keep their interests going. This is still going on today. We see it on steroids in the Trump administration. This recently passed bill that's going to just wipe out a lot of climate change projects that Biden put in place and go up on drilling for oil and fossil fuels. They're going to ramp up on that. So both sides of it exploit the issue for wealth and power. And what are we going to do about it then? Are we simply going to throw up our hands? No, I think we have to, as Bernie says, try to take control of the government in order to form policies that actually address this real problem, in my estimation, in ways that are beneficial to people rather than creating greater harm for people, more control over their lives or extracting more profits from them, as the major companies would like to do. They don't want to do anything about climate change unless they make money on it. I think we can do better than that. All right, so that's my 2 cents on that debate. I do not think that Bernie had good responses, but I'm giving you my responses because I've had more time to look into that article that Rogan was leaning on, whereas Bernie said he was not familiar with it. Anyway, all right, the next clip has to do with automation and artificial intelligence and how there's going to be massive job losses. Rogan asks what you can do about this. And Bernie, of course, first of all, talks about the economic well-being of the people who are jobless or potentially jobless. He talks about reducing hours at work instead of throwing people off the payroll entirely and keeping other people working 50, 60 hours a week. So reducing hours, enhancing the safety net, health care for all, free college, all those kind of things that allow people's standard of living to keep up. That's one of the big things he says. And then he's pressed on meaning as well. So let's take a look at their discussion of this particular part of it. And here's some of the things that they each have to say.
Making sure that in America, we do not have the massive levels of income and wealth inequality that we currently have.
But the problem with that is the taxes go to what? An incompetent, corrupt government?
Say to people out there who are mostly working class people, you got to get involved. I know it's hard. People are working long hours. You got to get involved in the political process. You got to make demands on government that it serves you, not just the very wealthy.
So with this one, the points Rogan makes, I think, is mostly 2, although I also want to focus on one of the things that Bernie said that was unexpected. Rogan is saying in one case that what do you do for meaning? He's pressing. This goes on for nearly an hour with a few digressions. He keeps coming back to the question of all these people don't have jobs. You might be able to support them better. But what do they do if they don't have meaning in their life? And I think Bernie gives some good answers. Of course, why expect him to have all the answers, right? Just because he's a politician doesn't mean he has all the answers for every problem. But he says things like people can pursue knowledge through education. People will travel. People will be interested in various projects and hobbies that they like. And I would add to that, you could say other things, not only advancing knowledge, but scientific discovery to meet the needs of people. Ambitious people who Rogan talks about, what are they going to do if they can't pursue money and profit? Well, one of the things they could do is put themselves into scientific achievements or doing things like improving people's health and longevity or finding ways to resolve wars or prevent wars, which is one of the things Bernie mentions, is building community and our capacity to build a better society. One of the things Bernie doesn't mention is service workers, human service workers. We will always need people, human beings, to take care of those who are more vulnerable, like educating the young and taking care of the sick and taking care of the very aged. So we'll need human beings to do those things properly in a way that's caring and of value to those people who need those services. So there'll always be room for that. And of course, my experience is that retirees can find lots of things to do, remodeling their own homes. Lots of men like to do that, or remodeling cars for that matter. There's things people could do like that are not only beneficial to their family, like having a nicer home, but can maybe even bring in a little extra income or do favors for people. Or another thing, people like to make stuff for free on the internet. Here's what I'm doing. I'm creating content that nobody's paying me for except through the ads on these videos, which barely brings in a few bucks a month these days. So I didn't do it to make money or for a profit, and it's not my job. I'm retired, but I enjoy doing it, and I hope the content is valuable. It should be to the people who are watching this, at least, or you wouldn't be watching it, right? So content on the internet, Wikipedia, open source software. People invent this stuff. They do it on their own time because in some cases they're hoping to make a profit down the line, but in many cases they do it just because they like doing it. They want to do it. fan fiction. There's another one. People like writing stories about folks, characters they're already familiar with and putting it out there for other people to read. So, art, transportation, scientific advancement, building community, solving social problems, all those things are things that people could be working on. Now, the one thing that Bernie mentioned that was unexpected to me was workers' ownership. And he talks about how that's an important piece of the puzzle. I agree with him 100% on that one. And it's something I've talked a lot about. The only caveat would be I wouldn't call it workers' ownership, I call it workers' control. The principle should be that a business is the people who work in it. The work being done by a company is human labor, and the people who are doing that should be the one who control it. Now, that's not going to work when things are fully automated, but certainly in the transition time, if workers controlled the businesses that they work in, they would be able to do it to their own benefit, reduce their hours, improve their pay, and not channel so much into big corporations or billionaires who already have more than enough. So I think that's a good idea, but it shouldn't be based on ownership. That concept is outdated. Businesses are people doing things. Owners are just people who invest money in something, and they can expect a reasonable rate of return depending on the scarcity of capital and the risks involved, but not just continually rig things for greater profits to the disadvantage of society in general and the workers in particular. So that, and then the one thing they touch upon here that I also thought was, Rogan talks about universal basic income. And I think this is a good thing because when he talks about how government can be corrupted and how programs can be run incompetently and there's a lot of waste, I think he's talking there about Bernie's ideas for all these social programs that the government would fund by taxing people. But a universal basic income is very easy to do without a large government bureaucracy. You simply have to collect taxes and then send out checks. Social Security has been doing this for, I don't know, since the 1930s, and they're very efficient at it. We also saw it in the stimulus funding. Just sending out checks to people to help them pay for their own way is a way of giving them some control and also avoiding a lot of government bureaucracy. But it has to be done in such a way that there's not a need for the government to test your eligibility, which means everybody gets it, no matter what your circumstances. So that does away with a lot of bureaucracy right there. And also you need, as they said, to have government do things right. People have to take more responsibility for the government. They have to work to take control of the government and to use it for purposes that are beneficial to them and not simply to the oligarchs who now run it. Also, we need more party competition, with Rogan touched on briefly that government is, he says government has a monopoly on government, but that's not right. It's the two major parties that have a duopoly control of the government. And what we need is to open up the system to more parties, more points of view, more different types of candidates, so there can be real competition and people will have something to vote for that has meaning for them. So fixing democracy is another thing that we could do with our time. And those of us who have time, I think, at least those of us who have some understanding of what's going on, should be doing that. At least I feel responsibility for that. All right, so that part, good conversation that went on and on. There wasn't really a disagreement. I think Rogan was pressing Bernie on questions that Bernie can't be expected to have answers to every problem that we're going to face in the future. But that's a whole different question. Final part has to do with Trump's suing the media over different things. And here, well, let's get a clip from this to hear something about that argument, which went on for about 5 minutes. This is the last clip.
If you ask her a question and she comes with a rambling answer that doesn't make sense, and you edit that out and insert another answer to a different question that seems more cogent.
Joe, you're walking down, you're walking down a dangerous path. Suing media has the impact of intimidating media.
That obviously wasn't the entire conversation, but I think it gave you a good sense of what it was about. And I think it demonstrates that each of them had good points, but they seemed to be talking past each other by not addressing each other's points directly. So what Rogan had to say was that specific cases in which Trump is suing the media was because the media engaged in clear wrongdoing. He cites the case of CBS's 60 Minutes editing an interview with Kamala Harris to make her look better than she actually did in the interview. And I think that's true. It was deliberate, it was egregious, and it was misleading. And he apparently didn't know all that, but he defends 60 Minutes as having a good reputation. But Rogan's right. Doesn't matter what your reputation is. If you do something like this, you should be called out on it, and there should be consequences. But can be consequences. Bernie wasn't saying, I don't think that people should not be able to sue public figures. We already have court cases, precedents, and laws that allow the suing of anybody when they're defamed maliciously and intentionally. So there's a higher standard for suing public figures, but they can sue. The question is, should they do that, especially someone in as powerful as a position as the president? And here Bernie makes some good points, which is that the pattern for Trump is not simply to pick egregious cases and use lawsuits to stop it. He's got a pattern of using the government power to intimidate the media and also to intimidate the judiciary and intimidate law firms. So this is a pattern of intimidation that is in a very bad path. And I think Bernie's right that presidents should not do this. Not that we should legally prevent them from doing it, but it's something we should be very wary of and concerned about and call him out on. Bernie's right that there are other means to hold media accountable, such as exposing them. I think even in this case of Kamala Harris's edited interview that reached the media and people became aware of it without the lawsuit having to be filed. So that happens. And, there's plenty of partisan media that's willing to exploit the failings of the other side. So you got problems on both the right and left. And I think they're right that media partisanship is a growing problem and has a lot to do with the segregation of audiences into different ideologies and different political camps. And it's made even worse on the internet, except for a few select shows like this that try to give you a very balanced picture, right? At least I try. So they each had good points, and they were kind of talking past each other, not really addressing each other's points because I guess they each wanted to cling to their point and not give up on it. Anyway, that's my take on this interview. A lot in there. It was an interesting interview, worth watching, I think. But I gave you some of the highlights and what I had to think about it. And I will be trying to get to another video on updating updates on political events sometime this weekend if things go well. So thanks a lot for watching. As usual, love to get comments from you. Please let me know what you think and share these videos and all the rest of it. Subscribe and send me a bouquet of flowers or whatever is within your means. All right, that's it for this time. Thanks. Bye.